Ignatius of Loyola was born in 1491 in the Basque region of Spain. His given name, his baptized name, was Inigo, and he eventually changed it to the more regal and churchy sounding Ignatius, although we're not exactly sure why or when, or even if he knew that Ignatius was not a derivative of Inigo. He was the youngest of 13 children. Sadly, his mother died shortly after his own birth. He grew up as a young man as a soldier, and he was a soldier's soldier. He loved being a warrior. He loved working out and having his body fit and trim and looking impressive. It's said that he would like strut around town with his sword and his cape and sort of showing off his muscles. He loved to get attention from the ladies. He was this sort of larger than life figure who was all about himself and the things that he could get for himself and the things that he could do for himself. Eventually, he was in the Battle of Pamplona. And in Pamplona, he suffered a pretty horrific injury. His leg was shattered by a cannonball. It would take several surgeries to get his leg into some sort of leg shape again. This is, of course, at a time when there was no such thing as anesthesia or painkillers. He spent the better part of a year in bed, recuperating from this injury and the subsequent surgeries. It's said that the only book in the house that he was staying in for this long recuperation was a book of the saints. And so what do you do when all you have to do is lay in bed all day? How do you occupy your mind if you don't have Netflix or something like that? And so he reads this book over and over again and begins to love these stories of the saints. And he read them sort of in the same vein as he would think about the warrior heroes of his youth, the soldier heroes. He saw these saints as heroes not of war, but a different kind of hero. And he would sort of lay there in bed. He couldn't really move. He couldn't go anywhere, but he could imagine being them. He could imagine, like sort of put himself in his imagination state, lying in bed in the guise of one of these saints. And he would imagine what it would be like to live their life and to be a hero of faith. Between the pain, excruciating pain that he suffers, and this incredible foray into the lives of the saints, Ignatius has this incredible, ecstatic conversion experience. There's actually several very interesting pieces of art which show the conversion of Saint Ignatius. And he goes from this guy who is narcissistic and all about himself and how he looks and whether the ladies like him or not. He goes in 180 degrees and becomes completely focused on God, on grace, on mercy, on Jesus. Now, he's still a larger than life figure. That didn't change. I mean, he was larger than life when he was a soldier, and he was larger than life after his conversion. It's just the focus of his life had completely changed. He goes on to do two pretty notable things. One is he founds the Society of Jesus, which is a group of monks and priests. He got permission from the Pope to establish this group. The Jesuits, as they would come to be known, end up being a worldwide order of of priests and monks who follow the way of Jesus. They are the Society of Jesus, but they follow Ignatius's way of following Jesus. And the prime way of identifying Ignatius's way of following Jesus is in his other major accomplishment. He wrote one of the great classic spiritual books of Western Christianity called The Spiritual Exercises. Now, you may remember from just a few moments ago hearing that Ignatius was a guy who loved to exercise, who loved his body being fit, and who loved keeping himself fit. After his conversion, he's then not as worried about keeping his body fit as he is about exercising his spirit and giving a tool for the rest of us to exercise our spiritual lives. And he saw the two, exercising for physical health and exercising for spiritual health. They're both exercising, and there were some things that just overlapped for him. The spiritual exercises is basically a retreat, and it's meant to be a 30-day retreat. And that's how the original is structured out. These 30 days are broken down into 4 weeks, 4 sections. A lot of Jesuits to this day, or even other people, will take the time and they'll go on this 30-day retreat and they'll follow the exercises of Ignatius Loyola. And it's a lot of prayer, it's a lot of silence, it's a lot of contemplation. Of course, most of us today don't have the kind of jobs or family lives or just lives in general where we can just pick up and leave for 30 days and do nothing but pray. And so over at least the last century, there has been a myriad different ways of doing the exercises and still maintaining some semblance of a normal life. I did the spiritual exercises as a college student. I went to a Jesuit university. The Jesuit priests there offered this to a group of students if we wanted to do this. I think we did it over like a 4-month period. I think we took each of the weeks and we turned that week into a month. We took each of the 30 days and we would do each day over several days. And so we were able to, keep our lives and still partake in this pretty remarkable thing. So the first week, the first section of the spiritual exercises is about sin. It's about death. One of the first meditations, contemplations, is on hell. It's also, of course, about faith and redemption and seeking forgiveness for those sins in our life. And so the first week is like a purgation. It's a cleansing. You kind of dig right into it. The second week is about Jesus and particularly how Jesus is presented in the Gospels. It's about the stories of his life and his ministry and how he would heal and how he would preach the kingdom of God. And he would ask us, people who were doing the exercises, to enter into those scenes as if we were there. I'll get back to that a little bit more as we go on. The third and fourth weeks are about union with God. If we begin with sort of estrangement, sin and death and hell, we end with a return to God. We end with this understanding of this mission that we've been given, the joy that we can experience in living out this mission, living out this gospel, this way of life with those around us and with God. If one of the first contemplations is on sin and hell, one of the final contemplations in the spiritual exercises is about heaven. But for Ignatius, you can't begin with the good stuff. You have to sort of go through the hard stuff, the purgation, before you get to the joys of heaven. As I said, you can still get copies of sort of the spiritual exercises as Ignatius laid them out, but there are also all sorts of modern versions of the spiritual exercises. One of those is this little book called An Ignatian Prayer Adventure. You can buy the book. You can also find most of these meditations online. And so you can actually do the entire spiritual exercises online. I want to talk about two different tools that Ignatius gives us for prayer. I mean, of course, there's the spiritual exercises. It's like the ultimate tool. But a 30-day retreat or a 4-month retreat wasn't exactly what I had in mind for this shorter course on prayer. So I want to talk about two specific tools that we find in the spiritual exercises. We'll do one today and we'll do one the next time we gather. I want to talk today about Ignatius's understanding of meditation and contemplation. He has a very specific form, tool of connecting with God, and particularly in praying with the scriptures. So you may remember that Ignatius spent this year laying in bed, and the only thing, he couldn't move, he couldn't get up, he couldn't run, he couldn't jump, he really even couldn't walk. If he was going to do anything, the only thing he could do was use his imagination. Ignatius would come to believe that God isn't just found in church, in worship services, but that God is everywhere. Everywhere. You can meet God in any person, in any place, in almost any situation. Which is why the Jesuits as an order aren't really known for, climbing behind their walls and just sort of having a ministry of prayer and contemplation amongst themselves, like we find with, the Benedictines. The Jesuits are actives. What do you call this? Active contemplatives. They're out in the world, they're teaching, they're in the mission field, they're evangelizing, they're working in hospitals, they're working in some of the most dangerous places in the world and finding God there. Ignatius believed that one of the many gifts that God gives us is the gift of our imagination. I mean, as far as we know, dogs, cats, duck-billed platypuses, whales, spiders don't have the gift of imagination. They can't imagine doing something or saying something or going somewhere. But we have this sort of unique ability to imagine that, we're on that plane going overhead right now, a really noisy plane. Or we could close our eyes and imagine that, we're in Tahiti right now. Ignatius believed that imagination could be used by God. That God, just like God can speak to us in silence, or God can speak to us in music, or God can speak to us through an icon, that God can speak to us through our imagination and reveal things to us that God would want to communicate to us. And so one of the ways that Ignatius teaches to contemplate, to meditate, is to read a portion of Scripture. It doesn't have to be long. It should probably be one of the story sections, like Leviticus or Deuteronomy. Numbers probably wouldn't be good books to go with, but if the Gospels or even the stories in the earlier part of the Old Testament, and you imagine yourself being there. Read through it once, and then you sort of close your eyes and so, for example, if you're talking about the raising of Lazarus, what was the meeting like when Mary ran out to meet Jesus as he was on the road into Bethany? What was she wearing? What were her facial expressions like? What was her voice like when she says, "Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died"? Is that said out of anger? Is it said out of desperation? How do you hear that? And then as the scene moves to the tomb of Lazarus, as people warn Jesus, no, don't roll the stone away from the tomb because Lazarus has been dead for 4 days and he's starting to already, there's a stench. You know, what's that scene look like? What's it smell like? What's it taste like? What sort of things are going on in front of you, but what sort of things are going on around you? What are you then feeling as you're in the scene? Who are you in the scene? Are you Mary, that's distraught? Are you Martha, the sister who's somewhere in the crowd? Are you another bystander? Are you Lazarus in the tomb, hearing this going on outside the tomb and around you, and then hearing Jesus' words, Lazarus, come out? What's it like to be Lazarus, stepping out of the tomb and into the bright light? Does your body completely hurt and ache from being dead for 4 days? Again, what's it feel like? What's it taste like? What's it smell like? What's it sound like? What's it look like? And out of that exercise, what is God trying to tell you? What is God trying to show you out of this experience of this kind of prayer and contemplation, of being in that place? Is there something that God is telling you about your own life and, you know, the world in your own day? That is, I think, the great contemplative tool that St. Ignatius of Loyola offers us. And if you end up picking up the spiritual exercises, you'll see these different kinds of meditations on different scenes, on different topics, different stories, different narratives show up, you know, as you go through the 30 days. And you can see how Ignatius is beckoning us to not just have the Bible be a story of things that happened a long time ago, but to have us experience the Bible with all of our senses, and just throwing in imagination on the back end. On the website, I have included the resource, the book I mentioned, the Ignatian Prayer Adventure. I've also included a couple of guided meditations that will help take you through what this might be like. You wouldn't have to always use a guided meditation to do this, but you certainly could to kind of get your feet wet.